Hi, my name is Caleb Strange. I'm a third-year forestry student at Clemson University. Today I'm with Dr. Hagen in the Clemson Experimental Forest.
Hey, my name is Don Hagen, and I'm assistant professor and forest ecologist in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation at Clemson. I teach a lot of classes here, including dendrology, which is a tree ID class, also forest ecology, forest communities, and some others. And a primary focus of the work I do, I also do research, is fire ecology, restoration ecology, and invasive plant ecology. So today we're talking about invasive plants. The Clemson Experimental Forest is a great place to go out and see firsthand the impacts of non-native invasive plants in forest ecosystems. So excited to talk about it a little bit.
So, Dr. Hagen, what are invasive species?
So when we talk about invasive species, what you're usually talking about is non-native invasive species, or what we might call alien invasive species. And those are species that are from somewhere else, usually the other side of the world, often from Asia, that were introduced either intentionally or accidentally. And they've been introduced to a new environment, and they, because of certain characteristics they have, they've been able to spread and impact that environment negatively. Now, not all non-native species are invasive. Only a small fraction of those species that are introduced have the potential to become invasive. But those species can have some pretty dramatic impacts. And we have several of those invasive species present here in the Clemson Experimental Forest.
How did some of these invasive species get here, Dr. Hagen?
There's a couple different pathways. If we can scroll down, if we can kind of pan down and look at this, the species you're looking at here is Chinese privet. Chinese privet is one of our primary invasive species that we have in here from Asia, as the name would suggest. And it was brought over in the mid-1800s as an ornamental species. We've got another really problematic invasive species called silverthorn, which you often see in the same kind of places we see privet. Silverthorn also brought over as an ornamental. Got some Japanese honeysuckle brought over as an ornamental as well. So a lot of these introductions were intentional. People brought them over here for a good reason. They like them, they're pretty, they have an attractive flower, an attractive smell. Maybe they're evergreen, which is a feature that many people like. But then they escaped beyond that point where they were initially planted. You also have some species that were introduced accidentally. That's really common with some of our invasive grasses. We've got one grass out here called Japanese stilt grass, little tiny seeds that can pretty easily get trapped and caught up on your clothes or in your boots or on a bike tire or something like that. And those species, like stilt grass, were brought over accidentally. They pop up, you wonder where it came from, and the next thing you know, it's all over the place.
So, what are some of the short and long-term impacts of the introduction of these invasive species?
Well, some of the short-term impacts, let's just look at this Chinese privet again. Some of the short-term impacts are going to be pretty modest, right? You look at this little plant, here's a Chinese privet, doesn't look like much. It's mixed in with some native plants. There's Carolina jessamine, that's your state flower of South Carolina. Here's another native plant called twisted stalk. So you see this plant here and you wonder, what's the big deal? Not really doing very much. So your short-term impacts are usually sometimes indiscernible. Maybe a slight change in biodiversity. Hey, we've got one additional species that wasn't present here previously, but it's probably not really negatively impacting some of this native vegetation. It's the long-term impacts that we're more worried about. All right, those long-term impacts, when this plant grows up, an individual plant can produce thousands of fruits. In the case of Chinese privet, each one of those fruits is going to have 1 to 4 seeds. Those fruits are going to be eaten by birds, and those birds are going to go around and disperse those seeds as they eat them and poop them out. So in a relatively short period of time, you can start seeing, one Chinese privet this year. Then next year you got 10. The next year you got 1,000. And so then you got to be concerned about those long-term impacts, which can be dramatic changes in biodiversity, changes in habitat quality, right? If you look at this forest where we are now, pretty open, right? Not a whole lot of non-native species in the understory, a nice, diverse overstory. This is typical of a lot of your uninvaded sites here in the forest. But once you get a Chinese privet invasion, and oftentimes coupled with silverthorn and some of these other species, that forest changes pretty dramatically. And you're panning over here looking at this part of the forest. You see your overstory looks the same, oaks and yellow poplars and some hickories. But that understory is dramatically different, right? You went from having that open park-like understory that you could easily walk through to one that has become this dense thicket of invasive plants. And if you look in the understory, if we were to do that, you're not going to see any of these natives. right? The shade created by those trees, by those non-native invasive shrubs, I should say, is just too much for your native species to get established. So they tend to crowd out and outcompete the natives. They tend to crowd out and outcompete seedlings and saplings of those overstory trees. So, as these overstory trees get old and die, if you don't have any young trees being recruited on the forest floor, getting established, what you're going to see is this forest shifting from one with a native understory and a non-native overstory to basically a non-native kind of shrubland, right? These overstory trees are going to die and not be replaced. So really dramatic changes in what your forests are going to look like, which in turn is going to impact your habitat for various wildlife. It's going to impact biodiversity, and potentially could have some economic implications as well.
How are invasive species affecting humans both now, in the future, and economically?
So the economic impacts of invasive species have been, I keep pointing down at this plant right here because it's such a big one and such a really problematic plant. But the economic implications of invasive alien plant species have been pretty well documented. If you look at invasive species as a whole, including plants in the United States, the economic impacts are somewhere on the order of $30 billion a year, right? That's billion with a B. Plants are a big part of that. When we talk about those economic impacts, we're talking about the control cost, how much it costs to eliminate them, but also the quantifiable economic impacts on forest productivity, agricultural productivity, and things like that. So $30 billion, it's a tremendous economic impact. We'd certainly be much better off if we could spend that money somewhere else, right? But that's really only part of the equation, right? That doesn't take into consideration all those impacts that are maybe harder to put a dollar amount on. The impacts on biodiversity, for example. How do you put a dollar amount on that plant right there? Right? That twisted stalk. That's a species that you really only find in the southern Appalachians and Piedmont. It has value as a member of this community. Maybe not monetary value, but ecological value, right? So there's a lot of things that are more difficult to put a dollar amount on, but if you look at the impacts, the ecological impacts of invasive plants, the impacts they have on ecosystems beyond economics. Plant invasions are actually the second largest leading cause of biodiversity loss worldwide. The second largest. Number one is habitat destruction. So the worst thing you can do, aside from just paving over a forest ecosystem and turning it into a parking lot, is to cut loose some invasive alien plant species into it. So the impacts are pretty dramatic, they've been well documented, and something that we're experiencing firsthand right here in the Clemson experimental forest.
So what are some steps we can take to reverse this invasive trend in our natural forest?
Well, one of the biggest things is you got to be able to recognize a non-native invasive plant when you see it, all right? You look at this little Chinese privet right here, doesn't look like very much, easily overlooked, and maybe even might look like some of our native species. But early detection and rapid response is really the key thing, right? It's really easy to kill one plant, right? It's really easy to kill 5 plants, 10 plants. But once you get to those more advanced stages of invasion, we have a whole forest that's dominated by plants that are non-native, that's when it becomes a much more difficult problem to solve. As you scale up, there's millions upon millions of acres of Chinese privet in the southeast, millions and millions of acres of honeysuckle and silverthorn. We're stuck with it, right? It's not feasible for us to eliminate these non-native invasive plants from the whole region. But one thing that we can do, or a couple things we can do at a smaller scale: early detection, rapid response, kill these plants when they pop up. Right here we have sort of an advancing front. As this invasion is creeping into the forest, maybe we can hold that advancing front, to use some military terminology, hold that, keep it from spreading into this forest, recognizing that we may not be able to completely eliminate it. And then again, keeping our eyes open for outlying populations that are popping up, right? Eliminating those young populations of 1 or 2 or a small number of plants before they become a dense infestation.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for your time.